everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Roundtable on Human Capital, Culture, and Heritage, Unleashing the Potential. This is the third and last roundtable that's taking place this week during the Public Policy Forum of the Africa Dialogue Series 2021. At the outset, I wish to welcome all our audience members who are joining and following our discussion through the Zoom platform or UN Web TV. Today's discussion will be focusing on maximizing the contribution of culture and heritage to human capital development and to the acceleration of progress towards the SDGs and the goals and targets of Agenda 2063. But it's also about changing narratives, about promoting a new narrative for Africa, a narrative that's shaped by Africans and driven by the ongoing socioeconomic transformation on the continent, as well as the efforts of African countries to unlock the potentials and the huge capacities of the continent, including its human capital, in particular through harnessing the demographic dividend and expanding opportunities for women's and youth participation. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts with wide-ranging expertise from arts, culture, and heritage to education and human development. Their insights, along with your questions during the interactive segment of this session, will provide new perspectives on maximizing the contribution of culture, heritage, and the arts to promoting economic growth that is socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. I'm pleased also to be joined by Mr. Brian Kofi, the moderator of our session. Mr. Kofi is a professional with degrees in diplomacy and public affairs from the School of Advanced International and Political Studies in Paris. After taking different experiences at the global level, Mr. Kofi had joined the World Heritage Center at UNESCO, focusing on the safeguarding and promotion of Africa's world heritage. Before handing over to Mr. Kofi, who will be guiding the rest of the session, I wish to advise our audience that interpretation is available through the Zoom platform in English, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. For a better experience, you are kindly advised to mute the original audio when selecting one of the interpretation languages. Should you have any problem in selecting the preferred language or muting the original audio, kindly ensure that you have the latest version of the app or that you are using a compatible platform browser. Lastly, I wish to encourage our audience to participate actively in the interactive segment of our session through the chat function on Zoom platform. The moderator will endeavor to ask as many of these questions to our panelists as possible during the Q&A part of the session. Without further ado, I hand over to Mr. Kofi. Mr. Kofi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. El-Shar. Dear all, depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Allow me to welcome you to this sixth session of the Africa Dialogue Series, a roundtable on human capital, culture, and heritage, unleashing the potential. I am Brian Kofi, African World Heritage Specialist from UNESCO World Heritage Center, and it is my pleasure to moderate this session. I would like to remind participants that interpretation is available in several languages. Please select the appropriate channel to get a greater appreciation of the valuable contribution that our speakers will be making. The wealth of our nation is not in its produced capital or natural resources, but rather in its people. Once that is said, one can only accept that the people and their human capital represent a pivotal force for transformation and recognize the importance of investing in people. Africa has the largest share of young people in its population, and these young represent a demographic challenge for the continent. In addition to this, from the COVID-19 pandemic to socioeconomic problems, emergencies are multiplying on the continent and preventing culture, heritage, and human capital from being a force for development. Faced with such challenges, we need to take time to reflect on adequate strategies to better tackle these issues. The African Dialogue series, aligned with the theme chosen by the African Union for 2021 Arts, Culture and Heritage, Levels of Building the Africa We Want, provide us with the ideal framework for this reflection. To discuss the key role of culture and heritage in unlocking human capital and in the development of Africa, I have the great honor to be surrounded by a panel of exceptional African professionals, all experts in African culture. One of them is the Professor Shadrach Shirukure. Professor Shirukure, he is a national of Zimbabwe with degrees in artifact studies and PhD in archaeology from the University College London. He is also a professor in the Department of Archaeology at University of Cape Town, where he directs 2 research facilities. Welcome, Professor. I would like to start. Thank you, Professor. I would like to start this conversation with you by talking about the mindset of African people regarding their culture. Africa is blessed with diverse and rich cultures and history and has an immense and promising human capital. Yet, the continent seems to be struggling to unlock its potential. Professor Shirukure, can you enlighten us on the realities and historicity of the obstacles to the unleashing of the continent's potential and tell us if education in a new form is the prerequisite to the achievement of our goal? The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much. Let's start with some numbers. Africa has the world's highest number of youths under the age of 25. It has the world's highest number of job seekers. 60% of the population of 1.3 billion was under the age of 25 in 2019. Brian, you said that was a challenge. I think this is an opportunity. According to the UniRank database in 2020, there were nearly 1,225 officially recognized higher education institutions in Africa. In the United States alone, there are 4,000 degree granting academic institutions. The United Kingdom has 106 higher education institutions. So Africa, the African higher education system is lagging behind in terms of numbers. So Africa from Algeria to Zimbabwe has stunning heritage. You can talk of the pyramids in Egypt and Sudan, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, Great Zimbabwe, etc., etc. People in the past used to do things for themselves, using an education suited for satisfying everyday challenges, the education that combined doing, thinking, and knowing. So that is the root cause of the problem. Currently, because of colonial education and its legacies, people no longer are capable of doing things for themselves. Colonial education was about dependence. It was meant to create job seekers, not job creators. So, Brian, you were supposed to read, memorize, sit for an exam, pass, and look for a job, right? So in that employment, you would help with extracting resources, ship them to Europe, and then buy back finished products from Europe. So that's an education that emphasized knowing for the purposes of passing an exam, not for the purposes of creating jobs or to help people help themselves. In the United States, dropouts start successful companies like Apple and Microsoft. It's not graduates. Who are the most educated Africans with top companies in the world? So the question then is, could our ancestors have built Great Zimbabwe, the pyramids, or Lalibela if they believed in knowing without doing, like we do, and in knowing for the purpose of passing an exam and to get a certificate? That's where we need to change mindsets. That's where we need to change action. Culture and heritage is knowledge, is experience, is skill. It is not something to be gazed upon by tourists seeking awe-inspiring exotica. What ways of doing can we learn from culture and heritage to help us solve everyday problems? We need an education that is beyond colonial stereotypes. We need an education that emphasizing doing and knowing so that people can employ themselves. Nollywood in Nigeria is about doing. It is about thinking. It is about knowing. It is never about talking or just about taking exams. We need ways of certifying village knowledge, village science, and other knowledge that we bundle under the rubric of culture. An artisan who is not educated in the Western system can still use their hands. They can still solve their problems. We need to certify them. We need them to create jobs for others. There is also a Shona proverb which says that your ugly possession is better than a borrowed beautiful one. We cannot brag about having a degree from Harvard, from Cambridge, and cannot create a single job, and yet complain that, oh, we have the highest number of youths and so on. We need to change mindsets. We need to come up with a new education that can help us. There is a role for everyone, for thinkers, for doers, for dreamers. And let us take possession of that which colonialism and neocolonialism continue to take from us, the ability to do and to think, create and do new things that will crystallize as African culture and heritage of present and the future. And that will, in my view, unleash human capital for Africa's development to meet the aspirations of Agenda 2063. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shirikure, for your contribution and reminding us the root cause and the importance of changing our mindset and going beyond colonial stereotypes and promoting our culture. I would like to focus our conversation for a moment on the promotion and safeguarding of our heritage. And to this, I have the pleasure of having with me Mr. Goma Tete. Native of Congo, Mr. Goma Tete is a specialist in the contemporary history of Africa and in the political history of Congo. Since 2019, he is vice president of the scientific committee for the inscription of the Congolese rumba to the intangible heritage of UNESCO. Welcome, Mr. Goma Tete.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Bonjour.
We are currently working towards a possible inscription of the rumba on the list of intangible cultural heritage of UNESCO. As a cultural heritage common to both Congo, rumba has been subject of numerous meetings and research for several years. What have been the challenges of this initiative, and how does its success prove that transnational cooperation can be beneficial in achieving our goals? The floor is yours, Mr. Goma.
Merci bien, Monsieur Kofi. Bon, pour répondre à cette double question, je voudrais en premier lieu rappeler que la rumba congolaise est un patrimoine culturel immatériel commun aux deux Congos et même à l'Angola. Du fait donc de la parenté à la fois historique et de proximité qui lie les deux peuples de part et d'autre du fleuve Congo. Plus que toute autre chose, c'est en réalité la musique qui a mieux fait connaître le Congo dans le monde. Il ne s'agit pas du pétrole, des ressources du sous-sol, c'est surtout la musique qui a permis que la République démocratique du Congo ou la République du Congo soit réellement connue dans le monde. Alors, quelle est l'origine de cette musique que nous entendons inscrire sur la liste du patrimoine culturel immatériel de l'humanité de l'UNESCO en décembre 2021? Il faut rechercher l'origine de la rumba congolaise à la croisée de diverses sources et influences. Cette musique urbaine, elle est née dans les années 1930-1940 sur les deux rives du fleuve Congo, dans les deux capitales coloniales les plus rapprochées du monde de l'époque, c'est-à-dire Léopoldville et Brazzaville. Elle est née à la rencontre de plusieurs courants et de plusieurs influences. Alors, le premier courant, c'est la rumba cubaine. C'est la rumba cubaine qui arrive dans les années 1930 à partir par le biais donc des disques 78 tours. Et cette musique qui a été emmenée aux Amériques par les esclaves, quand elle revient dans son terroir, disons son terroir d'origine, elle rencontre les musiques locales et elle fait donc fusion avec les musiques locales du bassin du Congo. Et à cela, il faut ajouter les traditions musicales des populations ouest-africaines qui sont venues par le biais de la colonisation. Il faut ajouter aussi les traditions musicales coloniales. C'est donc ce melting pot-là qui a permis l'éclosion de la rumba congolaise. Et dans les années 50, à partir des années 50, apparaissent les premiers grands orchestres de part et d'autre du fleuve Congo. Et nous pouvons citer 4 grands orchestres qui ont permis ce qu'on en appelle aujourd'hui les grandes écoles musicales de la rumba congolaise. Nous avons d'abord l'African Jazz de Joseph Kabasele. Joseph Kabasele, c'est lui qui a composé la chanson Indépendance Cha-Cha-Cha, qui est pratiquement devenue l'hymne des indépendances africaines. Et il faut préciser que Joseph Kabasele avait pour saxophoniste et pianiste Manu Dibango. À cet orchestre, il faut ajouter l'orchestre Hockey Jazz, qui a été créé par des musiciens de Brazzaville et de Léopoldville à l'époque. Donc, nous avons Franco, Jean-Serge Sou, Ganga et Edo et de la Lune. Ensuite, nous avons l'orchestre les Bantous de la capitale qui naissent à Brazzaville par Jean-Serge Issou. Ces orchestres-là vont permettre à la rumba d'être connue à partir des années 60 sur l'échiquier africain. Et il faut préciser qu'au fil du temps, la rumba va faire preuve d'une vitalité et d'un génie exceptionnel en devenant en même temps une expression populaire de cohésion sociale, mais aussi un vecteur de mobilisation citoyenne pour le développement et un plaidoyer pour le panafricanisme et la coexistence pacifique mondiale, parce que Brazzaville et Kinshasa aujourd'hui sont en même temps non seulement le creuset de la rumba, mais ils sont aussi les sièges de 2 grands festivals qui regroupent la jeunesse africaine. Nous avons le FESPAM et la rumba, le festival Rumba Parade. Et il faut ajouter aussi que les villes de Brazzaville et de Kinshasa ont été faites par l'UNESCO, villes créatives de musique. Et donc, au regard de cette trajectoire qui a donc permis à la rumba d'être connue à travers le monde et grâce à sa diaspora de s'être étendue dans le monde, les présidents de la République du Congo, Denis Sassou Nguesso, et celui de la République démocratique du Congo, Félix-Antoine Tshisekedi Tshilombo, ont donc porté en commun cette candidature de la rumba congolaise pour qu'elle soit inscrite sur la liste représentative du patrimoine culturel immatériel de l'humanité.
Thank you. Thank you
Oui.
very much, Mr. Gomatete, for showing us that intangible heritage spans beyond borders and can create social cohesion behind national borders. We will revert back to you during the question and answer as this subject is a very important subject, and we will thoroughly talk about intangible heritage at that moment. So I would like to ask a question to our next panelist right now. As we have talked about intangible heritage, it's time also to speak about tangible heritage, especially as the condition and of safeguarding the two different heritage are very different. To talk about that, I would like to ask a question to Professor Uduku. Professor Ola Uduku is a British African architect who took up a chair in architecture at Manchester School of Architecture in 2017. Prior to this, she was reader in architecture and Dean International for Africa at Edinburgh University. Welcome, Professor Uduku.
Thank you.
To talk,
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, to talk about intangible heritage, and I want to say I have in mind the famous Ilojo Bar, a national monument in Nigeria built in the mid-19th century that has been demolished despite its rich history. I wanted to ask you, as you are also a member of the Nigerian Institute of Architects and specialist in the history of educational architecture in Africa, what are the key actions we can undertake to ensure that these edifices are also recognized and preserved?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this august panel. I should say that, yes, the tangible is somewhat different from the intangible heritage in Africa. Partly, I guess, culturally, we have to remember that a lot of African tangible heritage is much more temporal. So apart from some major and obviously significant heritage areas, such as indeed Great Zimbabwe that has been talked about, the Benin walls, the walls of Kano, and obviously the pyramids in Giza, a lot of the heritage is much more temporal. So there's an idea around our understanding the fact that the built heritage has a longer life than traditionally would be the case. For most of us who have come from villages, you will know that houses that are made of wattle and daub and so on normally have a 3-year existence or thereabouts, 3 to 7 years. You take them down and you rebuild them. But certainly since the advent of colonization, and in the case of the coastal areas of Africa, the slave trade and so on, and missionary trading, we know that there have been these tangible forms of heritage. So buildings that last longer than, I guess, the normal dwelling house in vernacular architectural terms. So this means we have to have a better understanding of the importance of these buildings. But also tied up to this, obviously, in the case of particularly West Africa, is this long history of other activities that have happened in these buildings, and the need to start to understand our historical education more. So back to what indeed my colleague Shadrach was saying, we need to understand our history to understand the significance of these buildings. So even if there's a painful past related to some of these buildings, it is still important for us to valorize these buildings and find a way in which these buildings speak to us about the past. And indeed, as a Nigerian saying, you cannot know your future unless you understand your past. So this involves a number of things. I think, first of all, we are in the South. We do not have the ability, as in the Louvre, say in Paris, or the British Museum in London, to say, okay, this building is now a museum. We have to make sure that these buildings have a resonance and a reality for people on a day-to-day basis. This is not about sending people to the museum of culture per se. It is engaging these buildings with the communities in which they sit. So in the case of Ilojo Bar, the problem was that indeed it was very much the property of a family, and the family had a family dispute. And therefore, in a way, its relationship to the community in which it sat was secondary to its relationship to the family that owned the land. There's that discussion around the family realizing that the building on which the Ilojoba exists, or the building itself, is as important as the land. So in many ways, there's that relationship between the families, the community there, and indeed, obviously, the government in saying, well, you know, you may have a land dispute, but this building is very, very important. But then also the understanding amongst those in the community, particularly the youth, that these are buildings that are important, that we cannot keep importing our culture from the West. So the next skyscraper in Lagos might be whatever, 40 stories high, but that is not, it might be part of an international culture, but we have a heritage that we really have to understand, if we do not maintain and look after, will disappear. And indeed, it will become intangible heritage if the tangible is not there. So there's that need, particularly for this education, which I think starts from primary school. I wouldn't even say it's at tertiary education level. You know, we need to have these histories around our being able to look around us, literally in front of our noses, about what is ours and how we how these are important in the narrative and the stories of how we talk about our lives and livelihoods. I have to say that in the Alojo Bar, and some of you will know this anyway, some of the stories that have come out do relate to the fact that it was a Brazilian returnee trader's house, and he did actually have slaves kept in that building for some time. So the history is bittersweet, but some of this history we do not even know. It is only now that the building has come down that a lot of the history that we should have known about this building is being told. The building should not have come down, there's no doubt about that, but there are ways in which we need to be able to educate the community from primary educational level right up to doing the research ourselves around the importance of these buildings, and then importantly as well, giving them a function in themselves. So I will give you an example here, and then we can go on to the next person. Good example is the former prison on Broad Street in Lagos. This building, or rather the whole compound, was where the original colonial prison block was. The land is apparently owned by the federal government, because it was owned by the colonial authorities. The plan was to have more high-rise buildings. Fortunately, the architect Theo Lawson was able to negotiate for the land to be turned into what is now called Freedom Park. In Freedom Park, architecturally, he has been able to show remains of the old prison blocks, and indeed histories of the last woman who was going to be hanged for murder, whose sentence was finally manumitted at the last minute. And this park now is both an area where people are able to listen to music, but they also, school children are able to go and find out about the history of the Broad Street prison. So this is a way in which what would have been commercial land for commercial property has now been reinvented as a park that people can visit. They can learn about their history, and they can also have it as a social space in what is one of the most crowded cities in sub-Saharan Africa, certainly Lagos. So it's a green space in itself. So these things are possible, but we have to really take the lead in making sure that we can keep an eye on these. And this happens through better education and better communication with the authorities in the case of land that is owned by the government, but also in terms of those who are landowners of historic sites. So they have more than just a function as being, this is a historic building. We don't have that option. We have to be able to give it a case in a purpose in itself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Uduku, for underlining the importance of a better understanding of our history, and also reminding us that we need to engage and re-engage in our history and in our heritage, and this at several levels of actors. It is difficult to talk about the safeguarding and protection of our culture without addressing the delicate but necessary subject that is the restitution of cultural property to Africa. To talk about it, I have with me Professor Amadi Bokoum. Professor Amadi Bokoum, is a native of Senegal and an archaeologist by training, author of several articles and scientific books, He has actively contributed to the preparation of several nominations filed for inscription on the World Heritage List and is currently director of the Museum of Black Civilization in Senegal. Welcome, Professor. Professor, are you here?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you,
Oui,
Professor.
je suis en principe là, vous me voyez?
Oui, je vous vois et je vous entends. Merci, Professeur.
On est en binôme, vous et moi.
Exactement. Germany, Professor,
Mais
has...
je ne vous entends plus.
You hear
Je
me?
ne vous entends plus. Non, je ne vous entends pas. Je n'entends pas le micro principal.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez que si je
Non,
parle
je
en
ne vous
français?
entends pas.
OK.
Je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez.
Je vous entends, professeur. Je vous entends. Do you hear
Je
me?
ne sais pas si vous m'entendez, mais moi, je ne vous entends pas.
We might have a little problem with Professor Bokum.
Bon, j'entends la traduction. J'entends la traduction.
Okay. Okay. So we will use the translation. Professor, Germany has recently pledged that by 2020, it will return bronzes from Benin looting during the colonial period. It has also been 3 years that the President Emmanuel Macron has pledged to return African cultural property looted during colonizations. Since then, the promise has been caught in an obstacle course. Beyond the complex implication that the work of restitution and cooperation imposes, on what principle, ethical or legal, should the return of these objects be based on? Have you heard my question, Professor?
Oui, tout à fait. J'ai tout à fait entendu votre question, vos questions. Et vos questions ont un dénominateur commun, c'est la colonisation. Et l'autre dénominateur commun de votre questionnement, c'est le pillage. Et ça pose déjà, je pense, des questions éthiques assez importantes, parce que la colonisation elle-même, tout comme d'ailleurs les génocides que nous connaissons, tout comme la traite atlantique, peuvent être assimilés et sont assimilables aujourd'hui à de véritables crimes contre l'humanité. Donc, ce n'est pas seulement les hommes qui subissent ces crimes, c'est aussi toutes les cultures qui les accompagnent. Vous avez cité le cas de l'Allemagne et le cas de la France, qui sont 2 cas très intéressants. L'Allemagne, on sait que le pillard, c'était plutôt le Britannique avec le saccage de Benin City en 1897 par les Anglais. Les Allemands, pour l'essentiel, si on parlait un peu en vocabulaire juridique, aujourd'hui, on peut les assimiler un tout petit peu à des receleurs. Mais ils ont quand même décidé de rendre les objets, c'est très important, c'est à saluer, et surtout l'accompagnement qu'il y aura d'ici 2022 pour créer des conditions pour que ces objets puissent se retrouver dans de bonnes conditions de conservation. Mais simplement, il y a déjà un problème éthique qui va se poser à nous. Est-ce que ces objets étaient dans des vitrines de musées quand on les pillait? Certainement pas. Ils étaient dans des contextes, ils étaient dans des cultes, ils étaient dans des rituels. Est-ce que les communautés d'origine vont les accepter en l'état quand ils vont revenir? Est-ce qu'il ne va pas falloir les dépolluer? Est-ce qu'il ne va pas falloir les resacraliser? C'est des questions qui vont se poser et je pense que nous devons faire beaucoup d'efforts pour que les communautés qui vont recevoir à nouveau ces objets-là puissent les recevoir un peu dans un esprit apaisé. Je reviendrai sur cette question parce que c'est une question très importante pour l'Afrique, pour le futur de l'Afrique et peut-être d'une certaine manière pour le futur de notre humanité. Mais permettez-moi quand même d'insister un peu sur les questions juridiques qui semblent être insurmontables pour certains pays. Et en fait, c'est des problèmes qui sont, il me semble, relativement simples, même si les méandres de la jurisprudence sont assez compliqués. C'est la plupart du temps des faits de prince. Restituer, c'est rendre à son propriétaire légitime. Je pense que toute la jurisprudence de l'humanité montre que le propriétaire légitime est le propriétaire. Qu'on lui rende sa chose, ça ne devrait pas être compliqué, mais simplement, on lui a pris la chose souvent par la force. On ne peut pas la retirer par la force en l'état. Il faudrait que, justement, la jurisprudence nous aide à y arriver. Je pense que les Allemands semblent être très pragmatiques dans la restitution des bronzes du Bénin. Ils ont aussi, et ce matin j'ai appris ça, reconnu les crimes qui ont été commis en Namibie, qu'ils ont assimilés aussi à de véritables génocides. C'est bien de reconnaître, c'est bien de demander pardon, mais ce n'est pas suffisant pour absoudre. Ça aussi, c'est des questions sur lesquelles il va certainement falloir revenir. Je conclurai aussi sur cette question-là. Mais dans la pratique aujourd'hui, je pense que les Allemands sont très pragmatiques. Les Français, avec la déclaration du président Macron, ont levé le lièvre, comme on dit à la chasse. C'est très important. L'acte que le président Macron a eu à poser il y a 3 ans à Ouagadougou. Mais simplement, ça s'enlise aujourd'hui. Là-bas, le code du patrimoine, c'est comme la Bible. C'est comme le Coran. Apparemment, ça ne bouge pas. Et pourtant, il va falloir que ça bouge. Je pense que si ça ne bouge pas, tous les efforts faits par le président Macron, l'excellent travail fait par Felwine Sarr et Bénédicte Savoy sera sans suite, parce que ça va se perdre dans les méandres du Parlement français. Le Sénégal a eu la chance de récupérer un objet. Le Bénin va en récupérer 26 très bientôt, parce que les actes juridiques sont posés. Mais qu'est-ce que cela signifie par rapport aux dizaines ou aux centaines de milliers d'objets qui se trouvent encore dans ce pays? Il est évident que ce n'est pas au compte-gouttes qu'on va pouvoir régler le problème. Je pense que si tout le monde a la volonté de changer, il faudrait que dans les instances où on décide des changements et des statuts des objets, que ça bouge. C'était le fait du prince, c'était le fait de la révolution, nous dit-on, qui a posé un certain nombre d'actes en protégeant le patrimoine de la République. Simplement, ce que ces actes-là n'ont pas peut-être eu à gérer ou à légiférer, c'est que la République a spolié d'autres républiques pour s'enrichir. Donc, cette spoliation-là, la République ne peut pas indéfiniment l'ignorer et je pense qu'il va falloir que ça bouge à ce niveau. Et je pense que ça bougera et il y a des instances qui sont là pour ça. Le système des Nations Unies, on peut lui reprocher toutes choses, mais c'est une instance où les États, partis, peuvent discuter d'égal à égal. Et je pense que là, au niveau de la gouvernance culturelle mondiale, qui est aujourd'hui l'UNESCO, on peut initier des instruments normatifs qui puissent nous aider à mettre sur place un cadre lisible, visible et applicable à partir duquel on peut essayer de négocier la restitution des objets que des nations auxquelles ils appartiennent auront fait des demandes. L'UNESCO avait commencé, on le sait, vieux parvenir sur le vieux débat qui avait été soulevé à l'époque par Amadou Mokhtar et qui est toujours d'une très grande actualité. Un comité intergouvernemental avait été initié et toutes ces choses-là. Aujourd'hui, c'est enlisé et je pense que c'est une des voies pour avoir quelque chose de normatif, de régulier, sur laquelle tout le monde peut avancer. Pourquoi j'ai dit cela? Je le dis, je sais que j'ai 5 minutes, il m'en reste peut-être encore une.
Vous avez dépassé votre minute.
À 3 minutes. Merci beaucoup. Je le dis parce que...
Vous avez dépassé vos 5 minutes, mais concluez, M. Bokoum.
Je vais conclure. Aujourd'hui, on est en train de nous rendre, si je prends le cas de l'Allemagne par exemple, elle va rendre au Nigeria ce qu'elle a bien envie de lui rendre. Les Nigériens n'ont pas dit on veut ça, ça et ça, rendez-nous ça, ça et ça. Ils vont rendre ce qu'ils veulent bien rendre. C'est un problème. Et l'autre problème qui me paraît être le plus important pour le futur de l'Afrique, vous savez, comme moi, tout le monde sait que le partage de l'Afrique s'est fait à Berlin, la fameuse conférence de Berlin. On a berlinisé l'Afrique, on a coupé ça en petits morceaux et chacun s'est attribué un bout ou a pu jouer des épaules pour prendre un bout. Aujourd'hui, si on va à la restitution dans le cadre des frontières de Berlin, ça veut dire qu'on, nous, Africains, de 2021, on va créer un Berlin culturel. Il faut faire très, très attention aujourd'hui. Il ne faudrait pas qu'il y ait des batailles culturelles autour de la restitution. Tout le monde sait que ces cultures dont on parle étaient dans un continuum qui transcendait les frontières héritées de la colonisation. On a tout à l'heure parlé de la rumba qui articule les deux Congos. C'est formidable. qui va même jusqu'en Angola. Oui, au Sénégal aussi, on a fait indépendance circa. C'est fondamental. C'est ça la continuité culturelle en Afrique.
Thank you,
Récupérons
Mr.
nos objets en
Bokum.
cultivant les continuités.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Bokum. Thank you for enlightening us on the cultural and juridical difficulty of the restitution of goods, and also showing us that this is very much about bilateral relation and politics between countries. Now that we have assessed the importance of our culture and its safeguarding, it is necessary to discuss its place in our development policies. To begin with, I will give the floor to Mrs. Drani. Mrs. Drani holds a Master of Philosophy in Development Studies. She is also co-founder and former executive director of the Cross-Cultural Foundation of Uganda, an organization dedicated to promoting the value of culture in development approach. Welcome, Mrs. Drani.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a question for you. You have previously called on our communities and government to start recognizing that our own culture has a role to play in facing the current challenges. In 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals provided a common global set of objectives based on foundation of human rights. What role does culture play in the achievement of these objectives?
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to contribute to this conversation. The Sustainable Development Goals are premised on human rights, which ultimately seek to enhance the quality of life of people now and in the future. Now, culture defines the context within which the SDGs are implemented and hopefully will be achieved. So culture influences how communities see the world and how these worldviews determine what is important or not important to them. So that will also determine how they relate to the SDGs. Culture also influences our values and principles, shared values across Africa. And they determine how we relate to people, but they also determine how we relate to nature. And culture also determines what we perceive as the good life. Ultimately, the SDGs, human rights are all contributing to what we might define as the good life. Culture has been defined in different ways, but if you look at culture as an entire way of life, then it cuts across all the SDGs. Given that I have very limited time, I'll just give a few examples. So if you look at SDG 1 and 2, which is about poverty and no poverty and zero hunger, what culture brings to the table is community resilience. So through cultural identity and social cohesion, culture brings social protection and social capital. So communities are together because of a common ancestry, because of a common identity, and in the absence of the safety nets that are provided by development partners, culture provides that security for communities. So through extended families, clans, kinship systems, when in crisis of hunger and poverty, culture is a fallback for our communities. Traditional occupations and skills such as farming, fishing, pastoralism, and others all contribute to decent work and employment. And if only these could be built upon in terms of industries that build upon the knowledge and skills of communities to fight poverty and hunger, rather than importing different occupations to be built on what they know and they love. Culture is a source of alternative, grounded bodies of knowledge. So for instance, you look at health, which is goal 3. Across Africa, there are traditional healing practices, whether it's traditional birth attendants, bone setters, herbalists, there's traditional medicine, there's preservation of sacred forests where there are medicinal plants. According to UNESCO, 80% of Africans use traditional medicine. So that is a contribution that culture is making to health and well-being. Of course, now because of COVID, we might be overwhelmed, but in the background, that is what is happening. Culture contributes to cognitive ability, especially through non-formal education. Our first stage of learning is non-formal, and it is through culture. And later on in life, there's apprenticeship, there's initiation, traditional practices, and all these are spaces where knowledge and skills are passed down, which complement, of course, what we learn in formal education for those who are privileged to have formal education. Gender is another controversial issue, gender equality, but gender is a social construct and it is influenced by culture. Culture is at the center of identity and power relations. So culture defines the roles and responsibilities of men, women, and children in society. So culture also determines the narrative of equality and whether this is accepted or rejected. So you cannot speak about gender equality without engaging culture and understanding what rights culture provides for women, men, and children. If you think about peace and justice, which is goal number 16, peaceful coexistence is a cultural value across most African communities because we're so diverse. And therefore, there's a provision for traditional governance systems. There's an emphasis on compensation and reconciliation. And sometimes these systems work together with government, and sometimes they're parallel. But they exist and they do contribute, especially to those who are not able to access information. So the question is, how much do we as Africa and Africans invest in understanding, utilizing, and strengthening the resourcefulness of culture to identify sustainable development solutions? The challenge, of course, is to interrogate each goal and see where culture plays a role which could enhance or hinder the achievements of these goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mrs. Durrani, for showing us and explaining us how culture is very much involved in all the sustainable goals. In order to achieve this objective, this goal, it is also necessary to undertake some overall structural transformation. To evoke this, I would like to give the floor to Professor Charles Binam Bikoyi, a native of Cameroon. Professor Bikoyi is a research director and university professor specialized in ancient civilization and oral tradition. Since 2006, he is executive secretary of Sardotola, an international institution in charge of the preservation, promotion, and valorization of African traditions and languages. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are you seeing me, or I don't? I can see you, but I'm not.
I cannot see you right now, but I can hear you perfectly, sir.
Okay, let me try. I hope my video is. There's a problem with my video.
Okay, I think we'll hear me. Yes, we can hear you perfectly, and we will go with the sound, sir. I have a question for you.
Yes.
There is a new concept that have recently emerged from Sardotola, which is indus tradition. I would like to hear you elaborate on this concept and explain to us how the exploitation of these indus traditional resources can contribute to culturally sustainable development and participate in the liberation of the continent's potential.
Oui, merci beaucoup de cette question. Comme vous venez de le dire, effectivement, sous notre plume personnelle et avec un certain nombre de collègues, je viens de mettre sur le marché de lexique de l'économie et du développement ce nouveau concept appelé indus tradition. L'indus tradition est un concept non pas seulement théorique, méthodologique ou opératoire, mais aussi il est paradigmatique. C'est un concept qui s'inscrit dans la chaîne de réflexion pour les ruptures et la déconstruction des paradigmes des politiques africaines de l'émergence et du développement telles qu'elles ont été proposées jusqu'à présent. Vous savez que depuis les indépendances africaines, un certain nombre de préoccupations ont réuni les politiques africains. J'ai pas de vidéo. Et malheureusement, toutes les préconisations n'ont abouti à rien. toutes les préconisations n'ont pas permis de développer une véritable théorie africaine du développement. Alors nous pensons que le moment est venu de passer à un autre stade, à un stade qui permette que les Africains se réapproprient véritablement la question même du développement, la question de l'économie, la question de la diversité des opportunités qui peuvent s'offrir, et qu'ils ne soient pas, qu'ils sortent de la prison de la division internationale du travail qui fait de notre continent depuis la rencontre d'autres continents, n'est-ce pas, un simple réservoir de ressources, à la fois ressources humaines et ressources naturelles, et un dépôt de matières premières notamment, pour le développement, la transformation et les autres. Donc, il s'agit ici d'une démarche vers la culture, parce que la culture n'est pas que frémissement, n'est pas que frétillement, n'est pas que expression des contes et des légendes. La culture, c'est toute la vie de l'homme, selon le Cerdotola. Alors, on ne peut pas imaginer que les Africains soient des hommes, que le continent d'Afrique soit une terre d'hommes et qu'il soit un continent qui subit systématiquement l'importation et des idées de développement et des plans de développement et des politiques d'autres continents et d'autres hommes qui penseraient ailleurs. La solution, pensons-nous, est dans la réappropriation par les Africains eux-mêmes des connaissances authentiques, mais de manière scientifique et systématique, de leur environnement, de leur tradition, et qu'à partir de cette tradition, prioritairement, ils puissent donc tirer, projeter, créer, enfin, de nouveaux modèles pour penser, pour agir, pour prospérer, pour coopérer, pour commercer. Vous voyez, on entre la ZLECA est là, mais on ne va pas commercer avec ce qui nous vient d'ailleurs dans la ZLECA, dans la zone de libre-échange. Donc, qu'ils puissent commercer, qu'ils puissent communiquer, exister en apportant du leur dans la cagnotte commune de l'humanité. C'est cela l'industrialisation. C'est cela l'industrialisation et nous pensons que c'est un concept qui permet de renverser la perspective actuelle qui est défavorable pour l'Afrique. Ce concept d'industrialisation permet d'armer l'Afrique et pour qu'elle pose les fondations communes de son futur à partir de ses traditions et de ses hommes. L'industrialisation, nous pensons que c'est un concept qui doit replacer la valeur Afrique en amont, au centre et en aval des systèmes de production. L'industrialisation, nous pensons que c'est un concept opératoire qui doit permettre de définir les normes et les labels, n'est-ce pas, les labels géographiques, les labels identitaires de la contribution africaine aux flux mondiaux des productions pour le développement et l'économie. L'industrialisation, pour nous, si c'est la dimension culturelle soulignée pour que l'économie, la santé, la créativité, l'invention, l'alimentation, la beauté, n'est-ce pas, dans les cosmétiques, la mode, l'architecture et les beaux-arts, mais aussi la gestion de l'environnement, soient prises en compte dans les politiques de développement à partir, non pas du bottom-up, mais à partir de la pratique quotidienne, de la praxis quotidienne des communautés africaines. Nous pensons au sens pratique qu'on peut arriver à imaginer que chaque village africain, chaque communauté africaine est une production significative qui permette de repenser sa relation à la question du développement. Pour nous, donc, pour tout dire, donc, l'industrialisation, c'est l'utilisation scientifique, systématique et rationnelle des traditions comme socle, source et ressources pour l'industrialisation de l'Afrique. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bikoi. Thank you very much for showing us and reminding us the importance of using our tradition and our culture scientifically in a scientific way for the development of our continent. I would like to talk now about another important aspect of our continent's tradition, which is the linguistic diversity of Africa. And this is a question that, as I look at the chat right now, is currently being debated and asked by our attendees. And to do so, I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Erina Dia. The Dr. Dia, before moving to UNICEF's headquarters as principal advisor on early childhood development, worked as a chief of education in West and Central Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. She has co-authored several papers and journal articles on education channels and opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Dr. Dia. Dr. Dia, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. I have with me a quote from a linguist and professor, Stephen L. Walter. He said, "The evidence is strong that multilingual education programs where children's first language is used sharply accelerate the acquisition of reading skills, though this advantage appears to be significantly reduced in early exit programs where instruction shifts to second language." With this quote, we understand that language of instruction, along with other features, of course, is an important factor in a quality education. How can we ensure that education stakeholders and institutional partners are acting collaboratively, to address the issue of language of instruction? And acknowledging that 2019 was proclaimed International Year of Indigenous Languages, how can international organizations work towards the preservation of local languages as a cultural heritage and key role in unleashing the human capital?
Thank you, Mr. Kofi. It's an honor to be here with you today. Yes, education from early childhood to university, and one of my colleagues have said that before, certainly has a role to play towards preserving local languages and cultural heritage. But because of its particular importance in the life of the child, allow me to focus on early childhood. The beginning of preschool through the end of the first grade, roughly ages 3 to 7, is a critical time for young children to begin developing content knowledge, language, literacy, social and emotional skills, learning skills, competencies that not only enhance children's learning experiences in the early years of schooling, but also provide the foundation for more advanced learning as they progress through the grades. And because they also provide an opportunity for teachers and caregivers to nurture a young child's natural curiosity and eagerness to learn, it is imperative for educators to cultivate supportive classroom relationships and promote children's positive identity formation, recognizing that each one of them brings to the classroom a diverse set of assets that must be recognized and leveraged for school learning. And for the children themselves, these early grades represent a time of adapting to new cultural, academic, linguistic demands, as they're expected to learn the school-related content knowledge, in many cases in a language relatively new or completely foreign to them: English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, depending on the colonial history of the country. And they have to do so in a way that differs from those in their homes, communities, and cultures, in an environment which neglects and even represses their cultural identity. And this is done in spite of the fact that there's a lot of scientific evidence telling us that learning first in one's mother tongue leads to better outcomes in the future for the individual themselves, but also cultures and nations. And if embedded in the local culture and delivered in the mother tongue, learning can have a strong impact on the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, on a person's cultural identity and self-esteem, and therefore on her or his future participation in national development. Unfortunately, and I said that before, many children are forced to learn in a language they poorly understand, and adding to this in an environment which neglects and even represses their cultural identity, and the language that carries it, usually because governments tend to spend very few resources on early childhood care and education to start with. Secondly, and as importantly, because there's little effort into creating a developmentally and linguistically appropriate curriculum and pedagogy for young children. And this carries on all the way toward their education. Another colleague has mentioned that before. International organizations like UNICEF have a key role to play, therefore, preserving local languages as a cultural heritage. And this can be done working in collaboration with governments, civil society, the private sector, in order to ensure children's right to education in a culturally relevant context, with actions that can be taken at both upstream and downstream levels. At the national level, support towards the development of national policies and strategies for the promotion of mother tongue in early childhood care and education. It is said a lot, it's mentioned a lot, but still we are missing that on our continent. This will be required, definitely. Of course, implementation will involve capacity building in the area of public finance for children, notably how do we convince governments to put more money in that area, as well as high-level advocacy and identification of champions and models to be replicated. Collection of more rigorous evidence on effectiveness of existing programs will be a must for replication and scale-up. At the downstream level, we can have interventions to advocacy within local communities on the need for both early childhood care, missing in a lot of remote areas, and encouragement of families and communities to support intergenerational transmission of mother tongue through sustained interaction with children in these languages. These efforts must translate into the establishment of accessible and affordable programs using mother tongue as the language of community. That will involve identification and support to members of indigenous and ethnic minority groups for training and certification as preschool and early grade facilitators and teachers. Of course, there will be practical challenges, key among them the general feeling or belief that mastery of the national language is more important than maintenance of one's own language. While it will take time, this can be addressed through advocacy and communication for development. There will also be the need to produce mother tongue materials and train teachers to use this. It involves a cost, certainly, but a cost that can be later recovered from greater efficiency in the education system, society, and the economy at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Dia, for your contribution and for underlining the importance of local language in early childhood, as well as showing us at different levels how its use and preservation can be carried out. I would like to talk a bit more about the role and efforts of the international community, yes, in our strategies. And to do so, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Steinlake Samkanje. Mr. Samkanje is a national of Zimbabwe who serves as the Senior Director for Strategic Partnership Division of the United Nations World Food Programme, a position he assumed in 2018. With a successful career in this organization, Mr. Samkanje has also served in the office of the Secretary General as a speechwriter and as a political officer in the Department of Political Affairs. Welcome, Mr. Samkanje.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Thank you, sir. I have a question for you, which is very simple. How can the international community, and especially the United Nations system, enhance its support for African efforts to unleash the potential of human capital through leveraging its culture?
Thank you for that question. And as you say, in a way, it's a simple question, but simple questions mean often there are many, many answers. One of the answers, in fact, of how the UN can contribute to this subject is exactly through the agency of UNESCO. There's a whole United Nations agency that is focused on these questions and on helping to advance culture in Africa and elsewhere. So that's one answer, but that's too easy. So what I would like to focus on really are three ways in which the UN system can help address this issue. First is focusing on supporting countries, helping them to prioritize human capital investments. Second would be related to facilitating and enabling South-South cooperation. And the third way would be to support diversity and cultural differences and different cultural perspectives within the UN system itself and within the broader international community. So these are the three ways that I'd like to briefly focus on. First, in terms of investing in human capital, culture is, of course, as has already been said, it's about people and what people create. If you have no people, there's no culture. So investing in those people is really critical. that means investing in education, whatever type of education, but focused on investing in education and on schools. This is critical for our countries to invest in and to prioritize, as also been mentioned by some of my colleagues. Second, I would just highlight the importance of investing in the learner. So yes, you need to invest in schools and education, but you also need to invest in the people that are in schools and being educated so that they are able-bodied and able-minded to be able to take forward the issues that we're talking about. And third is to also in the 21st century, to be able to invest in skills that enable people to compete and perform in the 21st century. And overwhelmingly, that also means digital. So unless we're investing in ensuring that children and people in Africa have digital skills and are able to perform in a digital world, we're not going to be able to get the results that we hoped for. Second, the issue of South-South cooperation. I think this is really very important. It's very important in practical ways, but it's also very important in symbolic ways. It's very important as a message in that it underlines that countries of the South, countries in Africa, have important experiences and lessons to share with each other. Yes, it's important to also to benefit from experiences and knowledge globally, wherever that knowledge is, but there's a special importance also exchanging knowledge and experiences among countries in similar situations. And so South-South cooperation and that process is really critical for helping countries to deal with cultural challenges that in many cases are similar across the region, both in terms of solutions, but also in terms of how you evolve culture in ways that are progressive and important and in line with the goals, the broader goals of the UN system. Already the issue of gender equality has been mentioned. Countries have addressed this in different ways, understanding the experiences that countries and cultures in Africa, societies in Africa have used to move forward on a global agenda. It's really a critical importance in promoting cultural heritage and exchange in Africa. It's often the key to the solutions of practical problems is this kind of similar cultural exchange. And then lastly, the issue of diversity within the UN system. You know, we have to practice what we preach. We have to demonstrate also and show the value that we give to diversity and to cultural diversity, including especially to African culture within the UN system and within the UN family. That can be done in a variety of ways we don't have time to go into today, but that cultural diversity and showing that is valued in international dialogue, in the international community, that's a critical message and thing that the UN system can bring. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Samkanje. Thank you for showing us 3 concrete ways in which international community and especially the United Nations can support the unleashing of the potential. I would like to give the floor now to the Dr. Ishanlosen Aodia. Sorry, my video was blocked. I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Aodia. Do you hear me?
I can hear you, Brian. Do you hear me?
Yes, I have it. Okay, yes, I can hear you now. Sorry for this problem. Dr. Aodia is a national of Nigeria and senior social development specialist in the social sustainability and inclusion global practice of the World Bank. Prior to that, she was a consultant to various international organizations, including UNESCO and the African Development Bank. Welcome, Dr. Aodia.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to have you, Doctor. On February 2020, the African Union adopted its own digital transformation strategies with the objective of harnessing digital technologies and innovation to transform African societies and economies. My question for you will be, how can African member states leverage the digital transformation strategy to further develop the opportunities provided by Africa's culture and heritage for sustainable development, as well as key soft power tools promoting social and cultural values for the continent?
Thank you very much, Brian. So let's just start very quickly by looking at the promise that digital technologies hold for us. Because first of all, we must recognize that it has promise for sustainable development, and considerable effort and creativity is required for us to bridge, to use the digital technologies to bridge the existing inequalities, to give voice to the most vulnerable. And some of these people are the custodians of the heritage and traditions that we are so passionate about conserving. And they also offer the promise to strengthen the ability of communities and groups to cope with shocks such as climate change, pandemics, and interpersonal violence and conflict. Achieving the good country-led outcomes in digital transformation to accompany the commitment of African state parties will require an ecosystem approach that goes beyond incremental success to ensuring the impact on skill and dealing with the risks of exclusion, which I'll come to down the line. It is important for us to invest in human capital on the continent because the application of digital content will require us ensuring that this content is relevant to the people that it is targeted to serve on the continent, and also to prepare the youth to match the skills that are demanded by the evolving labor market of our times. Digital technology is important for documenting and preserving cultural heritage. We have, and it helps us to give a snapshot in time and to conserve endangered heritage. It is a powerful tool to reach wider audiences, to share stories of contemporary Africa, and to disrupt the prevailing narratives, which has already been alluded to. And it is also a good tool for African youth to share hope and spread messages of peace where there's conflict and fragility. The African Digital Transformation Strategy recognizes that education will be the bedrock for the innovation and creativity that is required to achieve its aims. And so through its flagship Digital Economy for Africa, or the DE4A initiative, the World Bank supports the African Union's strategy. I'll give some examples of various ways in different sectors that the bank is supporting this. For instance, if I take the World Bank's Higher Education Centers of Excellence project, which since 2014 has supported the development of at least 75 centers, African Centers of Excellence, or ACE, in 50 universities in 20 countries. These have been developed to focus on regional priorities in sectors such as health and agriculture. They focus on research into diseases, human and animal diseases that are unique to the continent, building on cultural knowledge and understanding of biodiversity to develop herbal medicine, plant breeding to improve the production of staple foods and meet the goal of the SDGs regarding hunger. In doing this, digital technologies have been critical for advancing these traditional knowledge systems in the various sectors already mentioned. And several of these centers are making remarkable progress in meeting their set objectives. For instance, the traditional use of shea butter in West Africa, which a lot of us from that part of the continent know, has been advanced by a female researcher in Burkina Faso, who has developed a cream from honey and shea butter for the treatment of burns. And this has been patented. Now, moving from the development of something like this cream that I have just given an example for, we now need to move on to commercializing all this knowledge that is coming out of these research centers. And we'll need to do this in an inclusive manner, beginning with the communities that contributed the foundational knowledge upon which such research findings and outcomes are premised. We need to ensure that inclusion helps them to profit from any commercialization, that commercialization and the benefits of commercialization reach the most vulnerable Africans. This will require strong support, first from the public and private sectors in the countries in which these research centers are located, and then from the international community at large. Secondly, the World Bank's art program supports the creative sector in Africa. Through its year-long We Are Africa exhibition from June 2020 to May 2021, it will be ending at the end of this month, it has created a platform to promote dialogue within and outside of Africa around various themes ranging from human capital to rural experiences, social norms, breaking stereotypes, and the digital future for the creative industries. The exhibition has created the space during this pandemic to highlight some of the innovations taking place in the creative sector. The use of digital platforms to sell goods and tourism services to local markets when the international tourism traffic was hit by the global shutdown. The creation and sharing of videos to create content and tell local stories to a global audience, providing a unique tourism experience of the beaten track. We will all remember last year how the Jerusalem dance from Africa became a global hit. And how did this happen? The use of digital technologies. Thirdly, sharing knowledge about African culture has been enhanced through the digital environment. And we see examples such as those of the Ifa divination from Nigeria in mobile apps. However, the full extent of digital technologies remain to be fully harnessed in the cultural sector in Africa. For instance, we need to look more into how we can use virtual reality for artistic purposes, the programming of intellectual property rights for cultural heritage, and the production of new forms of art. We do have to recognize that while digital technologies can be disruptive, they also provide opportunities for vulnerable and marginalized groups through the establishment of platforms for dialogue and social cohesion, and can be a force for economic, social, and cultural development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Odiawa, thank you for reminding us the benefits that can be derived from digital and for giving us those concrete examples. I will quickly give the floor to our last panelist, Ms. Thokozile Rudvidzo, Director of the Gender, Poverty and Social Policy Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Ms. Rudvidzo has, over the last 40 years, held leadership positions in various institutions. As a social development and gender expert, she has country, regional, continental, and international experience and works extensively on human and women's rights, gender equality, and women's empowerment. Welcome, Ms. Rudvidzo.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Thank you. I thought I was muted. Thank you.
No, I can hear you perfectly, Ms.
Thank you.
The world is currently grappling with recovery from the worst health and economic crisis for nearly a century. According to new data released by UN Women and United Nations Development Programme, the COVID-19 crisis will dramatically increase the poverty rate for women and widen the gap between men and women who live in poverty. COVID-19 is therefore a grave setback for inclusive socio-economic development in Africa. However, the recently implemented African Continental Free Trade Area is supposed to offer state parties an opportunity to have an holistic approach to industrial policies and address gender barriers and promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development. My question for you, Ms. Rudvidzo, will be, how can we ensure that the market liberalization, which will certainly open up important trade and economic opportunities, will not have a differential impact on women and men, knowing that gender inequalities in access to resources and opportunities exist?
Thank you, Brian, for that question. Let me start by highlighting that the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, is a market of 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of 3.2 trillion. So we are speaking big. It creates economies of scale for small economies within the continent and increases trade among African member states. And currently, the total trade stands at 14%, relatively small, and there are opportunities within the AfCFTA. Women play a significant role in trade in Africa and will be essential to the continent's success in leveraging the full potential of the AfCFTA. There are large numbers of women entrepreneurs in Africa, but women continue to face challenges and obstacles that limit their competitiveness and make their businesses less productive than those owned by men. And we all know this. Women also comprise the vast majority of the informal cross-border traders. Let's look at all the cross-border trading in West Africa. The majority are women. And these female traders are disproportionately affected by non-tariff barriers, including corruption, harassment, misinformation about customs procedures and regulations, and sometimes confiscation of their goods, and we are all familiar with this. The AfCFTA agreement explicitly recognizes the importance of gender equality. Article 3E specifies that AfCFTA aims to promote and attain sustainable, inclusive socio-economic development, gender equality, and structural transformation. And this is so key, especially if member states recognize that and implement. Likewise, Article 27D of the AfCFTA Protocol on Trade in Services makes explicit reference to improving the export capacity of formal and informal service suppliers, with particular attention to micro, small, and medium-sized operators and women and youth service suppliers. This is key that they look at micro, small, and medium, and that's where the majority of women entrepreneurs are. Let us all remember that women are not a homogeneous group. The AfCFTA implementation will affect them differently, depending on characteristics like their education, experience, location, and their role in the economy. Therefore, understanding the gendered impact of intra-African trade liberalization is therefore critical to ensure equality of opportunity for women and men under the AfCFTA. The AfCFTA's impact on African agriculture trade is particularly relevant for women. Agriculture is the backbone of the African economy, and women represent about half the labor force in this sector. The AfCFTA can promote women's economic empowerment by providing them with expanded access to regional food markets and stimulating demand for intra-African food imports. Smallholder female farmers in particular could benefit from opportunities to integrate their activities into regional agricultural value chains and higher value-added agro-processing activities. At the same time, however, female farmers in some African countries may be adversely affected by increased food imports from other AfCFTA member states, and this could be a challenge. But if the whole AfCFTA is implemented with a gender eye, this will not be a challenge. The AfCFTA's impact on Africa's industrial and service sectors is also relevant to gender equality. Export-oriented industrialization can have significant gender-specific effects. For example, the creation of export processing zones in some African countries has brought women new opportunities in manufacturing, but kept the majority confined to low-paid and unskilled jobs. Similarly, Africa's expanding service sector has brought formal skill-intensive jobs for some highly educated women, but the majority of the women in this sector have remained trapped in poorly paid occupations, including street walking and we are all familiar with this when we walk the streets of our countries. Across all sectors, the FCFTA will expand opportunities for intra-African trade. In doing so, it can promote entrepreneurship and economic opportunities for women-owned SMEs and micro-enterprises, both in the formal and informal sector, because we also have to recognize that in the formal sector, we have some successful women-led businesses. African countries can also help to ensure that women benefit from the opportunities created by the AFCFTA by adapting gender-sensitive approach to implementing the AFCFTA provisions that directly affect women. The introduction of a continent-wide simplified trade regime that is sensitive to the needs of small-scale female traders can help bring such traders into the formal trading system and support their participation in new trade and businesses opportunities that the AFCFTA will provide. And it's important that this is brought to the attention of women in the informal sector and small businesses. Likewise, targeted policy interventions that address gender-specific impediments could further improve the productivity and competitiveness of female-owned enterprises, allowing them to grow and to exploit opportunities created by the AFCFTA. And as we speak, the informal traders, the female informal traders across the continent have come up and formed associations to start engaging with the AFCFTA and ensure that they benefit when the AFCFTA is fully implemented. So the opportunities are there. The women in business and the female informal traders are willing to engage. Finally, the COVID pandemic has exposed vulnerabilities, but has also created opportunities within the AFCFTA. And the previous speaker did speak to this, the digital uptake and its potential for improved access by women. For example, in just a few months, COVID-19 accelerated digitalization rapidly. In Africa, 61% of a sample of firms that we surveyed at UNECA reported an increase in online sales since the start of COVID-19. While in another survey that we undertook, 75% of businesses in this goods sector and 61% of micro-sized enterprises with high representation by women entrepreneurs, which was very interesting and fascinating for us, shows that even women businesses are engaging. Therefore, digital deliverable services from Africa, which though currently limited, have grown to 2.5-fold since 2005. Whilst digital technology solutions in agriculture have been found to increase yields by 20%. If emerging digitalization can be scaled, it could be transformational, helping especially women entrepreneurs and businesses to sustainably industrialize and diversify within a global digital economy, estimated to be more than 11.5 trillion in 2019, and obviously facilitating online engagement and sales, especially for women entrepreneurs. So certainly the FCFTA can open up important trade and economic opportunities for women if implemented with a gender perception, as well as an increasing understanding of where women entrepreneurs and women in business are, and that they are able to take advantage of the opportunities that are in the AFCFTA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rosvitzo. Thank you for reminding us that women and gender are not forgotten in the implementation of the AFCFTA and the importance of implementing this one with bearing in mind the gender gap and the place of women. Thank you, everyone, all our panelists, for your contribution and for thoroughly answering my questions. Without further ado, we shall proceed to a question and answer session where the audience will be able to interact and ask a question via the chat. I will afterward resume the question and ask them directly to your panelists. Please feel free to speak freely, but keep in mind the fact that we have an allocated time. While I was listening to you, I have been noticed that there were several subjects in the chat that was that was brought up, the issue of heritage preservation, the issue of African representation as well, and languages. So I will start by asking a small question about heritage preservation. And the case that was brought up in the chat by Judge Ralph Bello Fadile was about Kunta Kinte Island, which is have been suffering from several climate changes, also climate changes impact. So this will also open and tackle another subject, which is climate change, that we have not yet talked. He asked the panelists, what can we do to preserve this heritage, which is also inscribed in the World Heritage List of Gambia?
I'm happy to go first to begin with, if that's okay.
Go ahead, Professor Duko.
There's already what's called the Roots to Roots Coastal Heritage Project, which is being both, as I understand, funded by UNESCO and has a lot of support from America because of the relationship, obviously, to the transatlantic slave trade. What is important about this, and this comes back to what has just been said about the fact that actually a lot of African countries linguistically, we are quite similar. The issue is more the fact that at colonization and the Berlin Conference, countries were more chopped up and so on.
Je vous signale que le son est très mauvais en tout cas. À Dakar, nous avons un très mauvais son.
So in the case of the coastal, what I would call the coastal heritage of West Africa, really from around Gabon all the way to Senegal, we have a similar coastal history, which is both painful but also culturally interesting in the sense that we've been involved in actually trading activities before the slave trade, during the slave trade, and even afterwards. Now with the Roots to Roots Heritage Trail, there is that maintenance of these links from the castles and forts in Ghana and Senegal to the coastal areas like Badagry in Lagos. But they're also part of this climate change, what could I call it, Anthropocene as well. The coast of Africa is also subject to climate change. So there's a way in which both heritage and the need to look at climate preservation are working hand in hand. Now, as you know, part of the issue about climate change is bigger than, well, it's a global issue. But what we can do by being able to realize how important this heritage is to start working regionally, if not transcontinentally, to really reduce the amount of overfishing and the issues that affect the encroachment of the coast around West Africa. I have certainly been to Ghana obviously before the COVID crisis, and it has been said that the coastline around from Cape Coast onwards has receded by more than 10 meters in the last 5 years. So it's a real thing, and the way we look at it is to look at both heritage, climate change, and look at I would say international ways of making sure that we're able to both look at heritage, but also see its effect or see the effect of climate change on reducing this heritage. So we need to invest in this and look at both technological ways, but really more importantly, just educating again the local and internationals, because there's a lot of overfishing and so on in these same coastal regions, which all contribute to the effect of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Oduko. Is there any other panelists who want to tackle also this question? I will, on a personal note, talk about the climate change aspect.
Écoutez, nous, on n'entend pas grand-chose à Dakar, hein? On n'entend pas grand-chose. Donc, je ne sais même pas quelle est la question posée. On n'entend pas.
Okay, do the other panelists hear me well? Is it only Mr. Bokum?
We can hear you, Brian.
Okay. Mr. Bokum, you might have a problem with your microphone. Though we hear you well.
Ben non, mon micro, il est ouvert. Bon, je vous entends un peu mieux. Bon, donc j'espère que ça va aller.
Do you hear the translator? Are you on the good channel?
Très bien, j'entends très bien la traduction.
Okay, perfect then. what I wanted to
Le
say.
micro est peut-être fâché contre M. Kofi là.
What I wanted to say about the climate change aspect of this question, and as you said, because the question was also to talk about the Kunta Kinte island and related sites, which is a site inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2003. The World Heritage Center is also very concerned by the question of climate change impacts on cultural heritage. So it has been recently working on a capacity building risk management project, which goal is to build the capacities of site managers and local communities in the management and evaluation of different risk to cultural heritage, associated with disaster risk. So this is an important question. Thank you for bringing up the subject of climate change, and the World Heritage Center as well is thinking about this and trying to find solutions. I have another question coming from the chat, which is about, there were actually many conversations and many messages about the representation of Africa, the representation of Africa in various international cultural conventions and other instruments. Despite numerous efforts and initiatives to reserve this trend, because all reports point out that Africa is often underrepresented, concrete results are still hard to come. What do you panelists think are the limits of this international instrument, and why does Africa, despite its efforts, still struggle to rectify this? Is there any one of you who want to answer this question? Dr. Ujawa, are you here? I know you have experience when it comes to World Heritage sites. Can you say a few words on this?
Thank you. Actually, I was trying to get my head around the question, but if I understood correctly, it's about representation on the World Heritage List and why Africa is underrepresented. I think there are various factors to it because, and here I'm speaking from my previous life and as somebody who has worked in the World Heritage space. We have a convention that several countries have adhered to. But at the same time, there is a perception following what has happened since the very first sites were inscribed in 78. There is a perception that World Heritage inscription could be more, how do you say, prohibitive than an opportunity. Why do I say this? Because countries have seen situations where committee decisions have seemed to be against development. In a world where we're talking today about things like climate change, and we also see this in the climate change space, where countries from the global south are saying we are not responsible for the climate change that we're experiencing today, because at the end of the day, the countries in the global south are the least emitters, but they are the ones that are being asked to make the most sacrifices regarding their own development needs.
Et puis, je pense que c'est pas la peine de signaler le nom du médiateur. Il faut juste que les médiateurs qui a fait la visite là, c'est pas la peine de les citer parce qu'on sera obligé de les citer tout le temps après. Juste les médiateurs. Non, c'est pas la peine. Oui, oui.
Okay. So, and so I think one of the things that we have done in the Africa region, that has happened with the state parties, has been to address this issue related to how do African states parties themselves benefit from the latent opportunities in these heritage sites, and while keeping to their obligations and international commitments regarding sustainable development, and climate change. And so we came, I mean in 2016, we had the states parties came up with the Ngorongoro Declaration on leveraging African World Heritage for sustainable development, which is to say, let us partner on this question, regarding how do African countries develop, harnessing the potentials that they have in both their cultural and natural heritage, and moving it forward to meet the development needs. The crying needs for access to markets, the crying needs for roads, for medical facilities. How do we harness the potentials in heritage and meet that need in a manner that still respects our international obligations to these conventions and to these global compacts? And these are the questions that I think we do need to provide support at various levels. And I think all the experts that are here today to support the states parties in this. Because once we also address, that's one thing about the development. The second thing is the whole question about colonization. Who determines the outstanding universal values that make a site a World Heritage Site? And I think Professor Chirikure also alluded to this earlier on, the same thing as Professor Uduku. And whose values are we talking to when we're talking about outstanding universal values? And what is the yardstick? When a nomination dossier is submitted, what is the yardstick for the measurement? And so having more and more African experts and specialists in the heritage field get more involved in these international processes and have, like Ms. Drani said earlier, the worldview is important. Have your worldview reflected in that global compact. That helps to take forward the issues regarding the measuring stick and the representation at the international level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ujiawa. Is there any other panelists who would like to intervene on this?
I think I will come in here as well and say there is actually a paucity in the way in which our educational structures work at the moment. So at this point, I am talking about higher education. Certainly in, again, West Africa, that has had universities since the 1960s. And to be honest, archaeology, anthropology, architecture have all been taught since the 1960s. We really have not, I think, been able to leverage as much as we should have in terms of our being involved in these organizations. Some of it is the colonization of education, but I would say certainly West African history is very well taught. So we don't really have that as an excuse. Some of it is the fact that we do need to be at the table to change the narrative. The narrative at international organizations is normally framed by the North, unless as the South, we actually make that request, which is now happening around climate change and so on. Culture is still being determined by the North to a large extent. But we should really, I think, take note of what is happening in Southeast Asia. Obviously, China is a big player as well. We have to value our heritage and actually argue for our heritage and the understanding of how we can leverage that value, which is exactly what Ichala-san has said, in order to be able to, if you like, meet the obligations that are important for our people. As I said earlier, we do not have the ability to say this is going to just be a museum. We need to show how heritage is part and parcel of our reality. We still live within our own heritages. I have said this before, you know, the stories of our elders are still as important. They may just be intangible heritage, but they're critically important to the way in which we should see ourselves as Africans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Duku. I would like to continue this question by asking something. We have talked about the different international instruments and emphasized the incompatibility with our continent in so many ways. However, when we take an African instrument, for example, the Charter of African Cultural Renaissance, adopted in 2006, how can we explain that only a few countries have ratified this charter? Doesn't it show a weakness in our cultural advocacy? What are your insights on this?
Ben, moi, si vous me donnez la parole, je peux dire 2 mots sur cette question. Je peux?
Allez-y. Oui, bien sûr.
Bien, merci. Je ne sais pas si tout le monde m'entend. Je pense que la ratification de cette charte, je pense qu'elle a été adoptée à Khartoum en 2006. En fait, pour moi, c'est un problème de sincérité, pour vraiment faire bref. L'Afrique ne peut pas dire qu'elle adopte une charte pour la renaissance culturelle africaine, qu'elle dise que la renaissance culturelle est un élément constitutif de l'union du continent et que les États ne la ratifient pas. Moi, je pense que ça pose vraiment un problème très, très sérieux autour de notre estime de nous-mêmes. Si on estime qu'on est tous ensemble, si on pense que vraiment le projet de l'unité du continent est un projet viable, si on croit à ce que nos intellectuels ont dit depuis des années, c'est-à-dire l'unité culturelle du continent date de la préhistoire jusqu'à aujourd'hui, alors il faudrait que nos dirigeants disent, est-ce qu'ils croient en l'Afrique ou en Berlin? S'ils croient en Berlin, on peut laisser là-bas la charte et penser autre chose. S'ils pensent qu'on doit gommer Berlin par la culture, il faudrait que tout le monde ratifie cette convention de la Renaissance avec ses forces et ses faiblesses. Ce n'est pas grave. Il faut déjà être dans l'intention et dans l'action pour qu'on essaie par la culture de gommer les frontières politiques héritées de la colonisation. Si on ne va pas faire cela, on va avoir des sénégalités, des ivoirités, des ités et des ismes qui vont faire que des catastrophes en Afrique. Je pense que c'est vraiment une question de sincérité. C'est une question qui doit être posée aux classes politiques africaines, à tous les États africains. On ne peut plus faire la politique de l'Autriche sur cette question-là. Enough is enough. Il faut qu'on arrête et qu'on avance maintenant. C'est mon très profond sentiment sur cette question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Bokum. Is there any other inputs on this interesting question?
My input, Brian, to this, without to go beyond. Oh, okay.
Brian, vous m'entendez?
Oui, Monsieur Bikoé, mais la parole était à Madame Drani. Elle va prendre la parole et je vous la redonnerai juste après.
S'il vous plaît.
Très bien, allez-y. Go ahead, Ms. Drani.
Sorry, who did you? Oh, okay.
I think it wasn't me who was answering the question because I've just come back on. I'd fallen off.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
It was Mrs. Woodvizo.
Yes, it is.
Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm looking at this question in light of all the other charters and the declarations that are signed at the African Union, including the AFCFTA. To get member states to sign on, it's critical that there is a lot of advocacy. And I think we have an opportunity in the cultural field because of this year's theme to mobilize and ensure that member states do sign in. Because remember, when these declarations and charters are signed at the African Union, is the heads of states that are there. It doesn't necessarily mean that the minister specifically responsible for that area of focus is present. It therefore, oh, I need to start my video. It therefore calls upon the different players and stakeholders in this area to mobilize and advocate to ensure that member states sign on. We've done a lot of work on the AFCFTA to ensure that we get the right numbers of heads of states signing on and countries signing on for the AFCFTA to be implemented. And I think we need to do the same in the cultural field, because then we undermine it. Whereas when it comes to trade, we've been out there and at the forefront. So my encouragement would be all the stakeholders in this field to mobilize and advocate for the countries to sign and declare their commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rosvitzo. Professor Bikoe, you wanted to say something. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Je voulais en fait continuer sur la lancée que nous a proposée mon ami Bokoum, n'est-ce pas, pour dire qu'en réalité, c'est une question de sincérité. J'ai personnellement participé au plaidoyer.
On ne vous entend plus, Monsieur Bikoy. Votre micro est coupé.
C'est bon, c'est relancé là?
C'est relancé, parfait, monsieur, vous pouvez continuer.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, je disais que j'ai participé personnellement au plaidoyer pour la ratification de la charte de la Renaissance culturelle africaine. Mais voyez-vous, de capitale en capitale, je crois que j'ai fait avec les équipes de la Commission de l'Union africaine, au moins 5 capitales pour porter le plaidoyer dans le cadre de réunions, d'ateliers, de sensibilisation, y compris au niveau gouvernemental. Alors, je ne sais pas comment on peut, ce qu'on peut attendre d'autre après la signature officielle par les chefs d'État de leur adhésion à une charte comme celle-là. À un moment, j'en suis venu à proposer à la Commission de l'Union africaine lors d'une réunion que l'on révise la charte pour faire tomber la clause de ratification et qu'on suggère qu'elle soit opérationnelle dès que les États l'ont signé. Parce que les ratifications supposent effectivement des procédures extrêmement lourdes qui font d'ailleurs qu'à la fin, les peuples qui devraient bénéficier des instruments qui sont mis en place sont complètement perdus, sont complètement coupés et de la connaissance de ces instruments et de leur opérationnalisation. Donc, il y a un problème de sincérité à la base de tout ceci et peut-être aussi de mimétisme, parce que c'est le mimétisme juridique qui fait qu'on s'arme de procédures qui n'en finissent pas et qui finalement coûtent très très cher, parce qu'au bout du compte, pour la charte culturelle, la charte de la Renaissance culturelle, c'est quand même de 2006 à 2021, 15 États seulement sur l'ensemble des États de l'Union africaine ont ratifié. Très difficilement, très péniblement, on est arrivé à 15 États. Heureusement qu'il y avait cette clause introduite pour que, une fois que 15 États ont ratifié, eh bien qu'on lance la charte comme telle. C'est ce qui a été fait mardi dernier. Donc, je pense que ce problème-là doit être repensé et les peuples sont complètement coupés de leur réalité. Mais ce qui est vrai pour la charte l'est aussi vrai au sens de la sincérité pour les autres organisations et institutions que l'on met en place. Une fois que les signatures sont données, la mise en œuvre ne suit pas.
Thank you very much, Professor Bikoy, for reminding us this. And exactly, you're completely right. The charter was launched a few days ago. Thank you very much to all our panelists for your contribution and for this rich debate that has reminded us that the challenges we face today are also sources of change and opportunity for the continent. Of course, when it comes to Africa, there is never 2 hours is not enough to tackle all the challenges and all the aspects. We still could have talked about the diaspora, talk about more about languages and educational system. But before handing over the floor to the chair of the session, Mr. El-Shaur, I would like to point out one fact. 2 days ago, we celebrated Africa Day, and His Excellency, Mr. Musa Faki Muhammad, the chairperson of the Africa Union Commission, attested that Africa had long eclipsed the role of culture in the promotion and formation of nations, and confirmed his intention to correct this trend. He also calls on actors in all cultural spaces to contribute to the development of a sound and feasible consensus By doing so, he calls for unity among the actors of culture and reminded me of a quote from Kwame Nkrumah when he said, Kwame Nkrumah said, "It is clear that we must find an African solution to our problems, and that this can only be found in African unity. Divided, we are weak. United, Africa could become one of the greatest force for good in the world." It was my pleasure to moderate this session. Thank you all panelists, and over to you, Chair of the session, Mr. El Shar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. This has been indeed a very fruitful discussion. It looked at the opportunities and the challenges of mainstreaming and integrating culture and heritage into development plans and strategies at all levels. I believe the discussion has illuminated some creative ways for unleashing the full potentials of culture and heritage for improving human capital and promoting socioeconomic progress and sustainable development. The discussion underscored the need for investing in youth, education, skills development, digital technologies, and innovation, and highlighted the importance of international development cooperation and multi-stakeholder partnerships. On behalf of all participants, I would like to thank you, Mr. Moderator, and to thank our distinguished speakers, and to thank all participants actually for contributing